This is Unit 5C, Part 2. The actual force of contraction, or the tension that can be generated, is certainly dependent on or affected by the number of muscle fibers that are contracting. The more muscle fibers in a muscle, the stronger the contraction can be, and the more muscle fibers that are contracting at any one moment, you'll get, contraction relative to that. So if you want to generate more force, you recruit more muscle fibers and you get a stronger contraction. The overall relative size of the muscle is also an important factor. The bulkier the muscle, the greater its strength. When people exercise and their muscle gets bigger, it is not because they have more skeletal muscle fibers in the muscle. Those people have an increase in the size of individual muscle fibers, and that overall increases the size of the muscle itself. The other thing that is important to consider is the degree of muscle stretch, where it is exactly. A muscle has a certain length. It can be stretched out or it can be contracted, and the strongest contraction force will be generated when the muscle fibers are somewhere at their normal resting length plus or minus 20%. So 80 to 120% of their normal resting length, and you can generate the most force. So here you see that shown in diagram, the number of muscle fibers activated, how the size of individual muscle fibers, which can change with exercise. Tetanic contractions can increase contractile force. We talked about that before. If the muscle overall length is anywhere from between 80 and 120% of the resting length at the time that the contraction occurs. If it's more than that, more than 120, it's stretched out more, or if it's less than 80, then you won't generate as much contractile force when you contract the muscle. In terms of functional characteristics, there are differences for muscle fibers. There are differences between different skeletal muscle fibers. There are different classifications for skeletal muscle fiber. It's actually a more complicated system than is shown here. I have somewhat simplified it. But in general, this applies to skeletal muscle fiber. The actual speed of contraction of the skeletal muscle fiber is all determined by the ATPase activity. The ability of ATPase, the enzyme that'll split ATP, release a phosphate and release energy, how quickly it can act. In muscles, you can find two major types of fibers. There are slow fibers and there are fast fibers. And this all refers to the activity of ATPase splitting ATP. In terms of formation of ATP, you have oxidative fibers and you have glycolytic fibers. So there are two things to consider: the speed of contraction, which is dependent on the enzyme ATPase splitting ATP. You can have slow or fast, and the formation of ATP, the metabolic pathways, the biochemical pathways that lead to formation of ATP. You can have oxidative pathways, which use aerobic metabolism, aerobic pathways, oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic respiration, or you can have glycolytic fibers which use anaerobic glycolysis. In other words, lactic acid fermentation. So overall, if you look at the two metabolic types, you have oxidative fibers, and some are slow oxidative and some are fast oxidative fibers. Slow and fast referring to the activity of their ATPs, how quickly it can split ATP. For glycolytic fibers, you have fast glycolytic fibers. So slow oxidative can be slow or fast. Glycolytic are fast glycolytic fibers. The slow oxidative fibers will contract slower, relatively slower, because they have a slower acting ATPase associated with myosin. It's a myosin ATPase. Remember, the ATPase is what's going to make energy available that's in the ATP molecule. These slow oxidative fibers are very resistant to fatigue. They will not easily tire out. So slow oxidative fibers, it's all in the name. They're using oxidative aerobic respiratory pathways to generate ATP. They have a slower acting myosin ATPase to release the energy from ATP. They are very fatigue resistant. Fast oxidative fibers also use aerobic pathways, but they can contract quickly. They have a faster acting ATPase, myosin ATPase, and they're relatively resistant, somewhat resistant to fatigue. The fast glycolytic fibers will contract very quickly. They have a fast acting myosin ATPase and are easily fatigued. The more fibers you have of this type, the more you're able to, in your muscle, the more you are, and people vary, and it's genetically based. They vary in the kind of mix of fibers they have within any particular muscle. So there is variation between individuals, and also there is the element of training, which kind of fibers you're building up and making larger. But people who are using, have more, or have trained for using fast glycolytic fibers, they're more able to carry out activities, or they're better at carrying out physical activities that involve a sudden burst of energy, like a sprint, a very fast run suddenly. Whereas people who have more slow oxidative fibers, or trained to use slow oxidative fibers, and this is the kind of thing you get with training in aerobic exercise. They're the kind of people who are better at running marathons, doing the kind of exercise or activity that involves a long-term usage of muscle. Well, okay, so we've finished with skeletal muscle. Let's go on to smooth muscle. Remember that smooth muscle is the kind of muscle tissue that you find around tube-like structures in the body, the gastrointestinal tract, the vascular system, particularly the arterial side of the vascular system, particularly in arterioles, you have a lot of smooth muscle. And also around the airways, you have smooth muscle. This is, of course, involuntary, unconsciously controlled tissue, controlled by the autonomic nervous system, the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. This muscle tissue is made up of individual cells, smooth muscle cells. They're called fibers here only because it's sort of a longer kind of a cell, but it is a cell with a single nucleus. Let's make it this color. So smooth muscle cell might look kind of like this size, much smaller than a skeletal muscle fiber. Diameter would be 2 to 10 microns. Just to put that in perspective, a red cell is about, A red cell is approximately this size, about 8 microns in diameter. And they can be up to a few hundred micrometers long, but that's not very long, right? That's not very large. Like 200 microns, if that was to scale, would be maybe, say that length. It's not a very long length. They don't have the kind of connective tissue sheath around the cells or collection of smooth muscle cells like you have with skeletal muscle. They typically they are organized in 2 layers along the tube-like structure that they surround. One is a longitudinal layer where the cells are all running in the same direction as the tube-like structure, and the other layer is a circular layer where it's running around the diameter of that tube-like structure. So as I said, they're typically found in the walls of hollow organs and tube structures, GI tract, airways, vascular tissue, the uterus, for example. They have essentially the same kind of, at the molecular level, the same kind of contractile mechanism as skeletal muscle. That is the interaction between myosin thick filaments and actin thin filaments. Here you see an example of a cross-section through the gastrointestinal tract, and you see the 2 layers. The outer layer is because it's a cross-section, this is the longitudinal layer. So you see it in cross-section when the tube is cut in cross-section. These smooth muscle cells shown here in this drawing are cut in cross-section, and their lengthwise appearance in the inner layer. So here, this tissue is found in the inner layer there, and this kind of tissue is found in the outer layer. Oops, sorry. Doesn't show up very well. I'll do it in green. This tissue is shown in this outer layer here. And that's what I meant by circular layers. Well, one thing that the gastrointestinal tract does is it carries out peristalsis, rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscle layer around the GI tract. If the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle contracts, then the organ will change in length. With contraction, you get shortening of the length in the area where you have contraction. So if you have, say, a length of GI tract or gut that's that long, and the longitudinal layer contracts, then it'll get shorter in that area. When the circular layer contracts, you get constriction or dilation in the area where that contraction is occurring. So if you look in cross-section, that's relaxed, and if you get the smooth muscle layer, that's a circular layer contracting, then you would get constriction. And that constant contraction, relaxation that occurs in the smooth muscle tissue around the GI tract is called peristalsis, and it helps to mix substances and move them along through the entire tract, going from the front end at the mouth to the rear end at the rectum. Well, smooth muscle is innervated, and as I said, it's innervated by the autonomic nervous system, both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. You have motor neurons going to it that can trigger different kinds of responses, inhibitory or excitatory. You don't have neuromuscular junctions like you do with smooth muscle. You have these swellings at the end of the nerves that are called varicosities, which actually means a swelling. And there you have release of the neurotransmitters into a fairly large synaptic cleft. The these very wide synaptic clefts are called diffuse junctions. But the point is, you have these a different kind of neuromuscular junction, which is drawn here in this diagram. Here you see an autonomic nerve fiber, and it's coming close to this, forming it swells out into varicosities, swellings near the surface of the smooth muscle tissue. Well, if you look at the microscopic characteristics of smooth muscle, it's much less developed and organized than the skeletal muscle. It doesn't have any particular very repetitive pattern like skeletal muscle. It doesn't have T-tubules that deliver a signal down into it. The plasma or cell membrane around the skeletal muscle cell has certain characteristics that are certainly unique to it, much different from skeletal muscle. You have calcium is sequestered in a extracellular space near these pouch-like infoldings called calveoli, and they allow for a rapid flow or influx of calcium when channels are opening. No striation. It's not so organized in terms of the way the thick and thin fibers are organized relative to each other that you have actual visible striations. So the tissue is not striped. There are thin and thick filaments present, as I said, thin actin and thick myosin filaments, but there's no repetitive pattern that allows for striping or striations. Well, the ratio, or the relative ratio of thick to thin, is lower in skeletal, is lower in smooth muscle than thick, than in smooth muscle than in skeletal muscle. And the thick filaments have heads along their entire length, not more towards one end. They're quite different tissues. You get actually a diagonal arrangement of these thick and thin filaments. So when the skeletal muscle tissue contracts, the individual cells will, when they contract, they'll contract in a corkscrew manner, and that's shown. I wouldn't worry about these details down here, but that's shown in the next diagram. So you have these filaments, and you get contraction, and you have this change in shape as shown here in this diagram. When the smooth muscle tissue contracts, it'll contract, the whole sheet will contract in a particular area. So you have many smooth muscle cells, say here, you have a sheet of smooth muscle. This is not very beautiful particular drawing, but let's say we're looking at a sheet of smooth muscle cells all aligned like that right next to each other. I'll try and put in nuclei here for each of these cells, right? So you have a whole sheet of it, and the sheet will contract in a slow synchronized manner together. It contracts, the tissue contracts typically in unison in that area, reflecting the coupling between the cells, which is due to gap junctions between cells. So action potentials that are generated because of the activity of the autonomic nerve fibers will spread in a certain area. For example, when you have peristaltic contraction in the GI tract, it is in one area and then progresses typically down the length of the GI tract. These cells can also have a rhythmic contraction, self-excitatory. They can depolarize without any external stimuli. The kind of thing that does actually occur mostly with smooth muscle, and this is a very characteristic feature of smooth muscle, is that when it gets stretched, it responds by contracting. So if you swallow a bolus of food, a lump of food, essentially, that's what bolus. You should know what bolus means. If you swallow a bolus of food, that tends to stretch out the smooth muscle, as it goes through the GI tract, and that'll trigger contractions, rhythmic contractions. The contraction mechanism, as I said earlier, is the same. It's the sliding filament mechanism, similar to the one you see in skeletal muscle, interaction between actin and myosin filaments. The final trigger, again, the similarity is that it is due to a rise in calcium within the cell, in this case the smooth muscle cell. It does get released from sarcoplasmic reticulum and interacts to result in activation of the myosin so that it interacts with actin. There is a molecule, actually I'm going to not discuss this. I don't think it's necessary. There is a molecule involved in this calcium-mediated activation. It's called calmodulin, and that triggers, the interaction between calcium and calmodulin will trigger the whole event. But I'm not going to get into any more detail than necessary here. It's more than you need, really. Some particular characteristics of contraction is that there is smooth muscle tone. The contraction is slow and prolonged typically when it does contract. The amount of energy used is quite low, minimal amounts of energy needed for contraction. And as I said earlier, typically contraction is in fact in response to stretch. The response to stretch phenomena is called the stress relaxation response. It's a very brief response. If stretched, the smooth muscle cells will contract as a sheet. Remember, a slow gradual contraction in that area. It'll contract and adopt to the new length. But that new shorter length will be able to, still contract more because it's not a complete 100% contraction. It enables organs like the stomach and the bladder to temporarily store contents. As it fills, the bladder fills, it actually relaxes. That's a little bit different from what I was saying up here. I don't know if this is a good example, because the bladder relaxes whereas the stomach, when filled, will increase in its activity. The bladder goes the opposite way. Now, smooth muscle can, in fact, divide, and that's actually quite an important adaptation that it has, and in some disease processes is quite an important feature of smooth muscle, contributing to the disease process. Under certain circumstances, you get normal increase in numbers, and in other cases, with the disease, you can get increase in the number of smooth muscle cells. It increases in the number, and that's a process called hyperplasia. And this term is pathology term or physiology term, which refers to an increase in number of cells. An example of that would be the effect of estrogen on the uterus. The uterus in a female can increase in its size tremendously. It'll increase at puberty, but it also increases tremendously during pregnancy. That increase in size at puberty and the increase in size during pregnancy are both driven by estrogen and due to an increase in the number of smooth muscle cells because of the rapid division and hyperplasia of the cells. You can have some different types of smooth muscle. You can have single unit which is commonly called visceral muscle tissue. It'll contract rhythmically as a unit. The single unit is a collection of smooth muscle cells which are acting together as a unit because they're electrically coupled together via the gap junctions that allow for easy passage of charged ions between the cells. You get these typically spontaneous action potentials being generated, and the whole area or region will contract in response. They typically exhibit that stress relaxation response that I talked about before. It's not stress relaxation response. Also, there's multi-unit smooth muscle. These kind of multi-unit smooth muscle tissue is found in the larger airways leading to the lungs, in the larger arteries, in erector pili muscles. These are muscles that are attached to hair. That sometimes when you get a chill or fear or surprise or something, the hair on your arm or the back of your neck can rise up, and that's due to an erector pili muscle attached to the base of hair. They're in the hair follicle itself. I don't know how good a diagram that is, but the yellow is supposed to be a hair and the brown is supposed to be a erector pili muscle. Multi-unit smooth muscle tissue characteristic are very few gap junctions, very few spontaneous depolarizations. They are independent of other cells from each other. They don't all act together. It's different from most other smooth muscle. In terms of disease, there are a number of important diseases that can affect smooth muscle, and in these last few slides I will do a very, very cursory job of covering it, because these are large topics that really deserve to get more detail, but you should be aware of them. There is a genetically based inherited disease called muscular dystrophy, which can affect muscle. You get increase in fat and connective tissue deposit in the muscle, and the muscle fibers themselves will shrink, they'll atrophy. That's muscular dystrophy. There's also another genetically based inherited disease called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's a sex-linked disease carried by females, expressed in males, and usually diagnosed at a fairly early age. And the end result, of course, is because it affects the muscle, is that it seriously affects the individual who carries this and expresses this genetic trait. It progresses from the extremities upward, and eventually, unfortunately, people die of respiratory failure in their 20s that cannot breathe adequately to sustain life. It's due to the lack of a cytoplasmic protein that's expressed normally and found in the muscle tissue which is called dystrophin. So they lack that. There is no cure. They've been trying muscle stem cell transfer therapy, but right now it's still not a treatable disease. In terms of there are other diseases which we won't get into that affect the muscle. In terms of developmental characteristics, there is this topic that you should be aware of, and that's related to regeneration of muscle. In terms of cardiac and skeletal muscle, they cannot multiply. They are amitotic. They cannot, once it's mature and developed, it will not when you reach the adult size, you don't get increased numbers through exercise or anything like that. They are amitotic. They will not carry out mitosis and divide, but they can lengthen and they can thicken with more work. Certainly skeletal muscle will. Normally in an adult, if you get a larger heart, it's because you have cardiovascular disease and the heart has to work harder. So it's not a good sign if your cardiac muscle of the heart is getting big, if the heart size is getting bigger. But it does have that ability. It's important to understand that these two tissues, cardiac and skeletal muscle, normally do not multiply. The cells don't increase in number in an adult. However, smooth muscle has very good regenerative ability. It can multiply, and it can multiply actually quite quickly. And I gave you two examples. One normal example in which the uterus gets larger. Most of the wall of the uterus is smooth muscle. The wall of the uterus gets much larger with pregnancy, and I didn't give you a particular example, but it can also increase, smooth muscle can increase in disease. The one you can get hyperplasia in asthma, for example. Smooth muscle around the airways can get quite increased in number, and the band of smooth muscle gets much thicker. And that's actually part of the basis of the disease problem. Anyhow, we'll go through that later, in a later lecture. After birth, you have muscular development, and it reflects the stated development of the neuromuscular, increasing neuromuscular coordination develops with development of the muscle tissue. And that development typically occurs in a head-to-toe direction, and typically proximal to distal, from the upper arm down to the hands, from the upper leg down to the feet. That's what proximal distal means. Head to toe and proximal to distal, increasing development after birth of the control of the muscular tissue. Peak neural control is achieved in mid-adolescence, and is sustained essentially for a while, but falls off. The peak control of your muscles is falling off once you pass mid-20s probably. Athletic training can certainly improve neuromuscular control. It's a very important aspect of or method of improving neuromuscular control. There are developmental aspects that differ between male and females in terms of muscle tissue, particularly skeletal muscle tissue. There is a reason why men are overall typically stronger than women, and that is because on average in women skeletal muscle makes up about 36% of their body mass, whereas in men it makes up 42%, a larger percentage of the body mass. Mostly it's due to the fact that males produce much more testosterone than females, and that drives increase in the amount of muscle tissue. They have more muscle mass, so they're generally stronger. However, if you look at individual strength per unit of muscle, if looking at the, how much force or tension can be generated with an equal amount of muscle tissue for men and women, there is no difference. The tissue is the same. It's just that there's typically more in men than in women. As a person ages, there's more connective tissue appearing in the skeletal muscle, and the muscle fibers decrease in number. By the age of 80, 50% of the muscle mass is lost. That's a process called sarcopenia. Penia refers to a lack of or a decrease in, just like anemia. It's in this case sarcopenia refers to decrease in the muscle mass. Regular exercise, however, can reverse that process, not 100% certainly, but regular exercise can reverse sarcopenia. There is also that's referring to skeletal muscle. There's also aging the cardiovascular system, and that'll affect every organ because, with decreased efficiency of delivery of oxygen by blood, you will have an effect on all the organs, on all the tissues supplied by that cardiovascular system. You can have the process of atherosclerosis blocking arteries, leading to something that's not that is not uncommon in elderly people, and that's temporary severe pain in the legs because of poor circulation to the legs. And that's the end of Unit 5C, Part 2.